Hey, 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 it's another episode of the Council of Trent podcast and another dialogue with Tim Gordon here. Welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. Want to remind you, by the way, if you want to support the podcast so that we can keep bringing in great guests like this here onto the show to have these really good dialogues and get at the crux, the kernels of truth, to get at that which matters most. Highly encourage you to go to trenthornpodcast.com, become a subscriber for as little as $5 a month. You get access to bonus content. You get premium access, early previews. Our patrons were able to see this dialogue 24 hours early. And for future dialogues, you can get sneak peeks as well, access to our study series, all kinds of great stuff available at trenthornpodcast.com. Support us so we can keep bringing on nice gentlemen like Mr. Tim Gordon. Tim, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Great to still be here.
Oh, yeah. So we had this episode will probably air a week or two after our other dialogue that we had about the issue of feminism. So cool. When I asked you to come down, I figured you're coming all the way down here from where you live. You're driving a bit of a ways. And I figured, let's get some good time out in the studio to talk about things that Catholics are disagreeing about. And I saw Catholics have been disagreeing about feminism, about women. So we had a good chat about that. Yeah. Another big one I've seen people disagree with was on the death penalty. And I thought it'd be nice for you to, because this came up ever so briefly. You know what's funny about this? I remember there was I think I was on social media, on Twitter, responding to a priest. I don't think it was Father Martin. It might have been Father Haran, who's kind of like mini Father Martin, saying that, we need to approach the death penalty with the same equal vigor as we do when it comes to the issue of abortion. I remember. Well, it might have been that. There was another one I couldn't handle. It was a priest. I don't know if you saw this or not. It was a priest who said, one of these right to life guys came to me and wanted to do crosses for victims of abortion.
Oh, right.
So yeah. I said, sure, if you do crosses for victims of the death penalty and human trafficking and the whatever, immigration, whatever.
Right.
And I said, I would say deal. So I would say for 2019, I would put up 7 crosses for capital punishment, or 15 crosses for capital punishment, 7 for something else, and then 600,000 crosses for abortion. So it's I hate it. And that's one thing. So we could start where we agree, because that's always pleasant and enjoyable. That I do hate it when people try to create this kind of false, this is one I think you and I could agree on a lot, that obviously we should be consistent when it means we defend life, but sometimes people use that as an excuse, I think, to downplay responding to the issue of abortion. What do you think?
Well, yeah, certainly both you and I hate abortion. No doubt about that. We hate it equally. In terms of the death penalty and its equation to abortion, not that you're equating it to abortion. I don't think you think it's at all in the same league.
Well, I don't think it's the same. I don't think it's the same kind of evil, but I do think that the church teaches that it's something that ought not be done anymore, and that's in continuity with previous teaching. But my point being that even if we, disagree about that was what prompted me, because I think then I said on social media, well, the death penalty is wrong, but we can approach evils with different intensities. If something is the evil of the day, it deserves the bulk of our efforts. And I would say the death penalty is wrong, but it's not something that deserves the same equal vigor as something like abortion, which is killing hundreds of thousands of children, every few months. But then we might disagree then about whether we could say the death penalty is wrong. And that's where I think you shared with me, we had just a tiny bit of back and forth, but I didn't want to get into it in great detail, but now we can.
No, I don't think the death penalty is wrong. I think the church teaches it's a conditional good. But so suffice to say that there's the locus in quo, the disagreement. Not that I'm trying to jump right into it, but I guess again I thought that we might characterize it a little more similarly, but we'll wait and see, I guess.
Well, here's what I thought we could do. Why don't we read? So what prompted this, especially for Catholics to talk about this a lot, was back in 2018 when Pope Francis revised the Catechism from its previous wording on this subject. So I'll read through what was previously there from 1997, because the paragraph on the death penalty is an interesting one, because it's been revised multiple times. It was there in the original 94 Universal Catechism, but then it was revised in 97 with what Pope St. John Paul II said in the Gospel of Life.
Right.
I'll read that and then we'll read its revision. So the Catechism originally said, assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, the traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty, if this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. If, however, non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means, as these are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and more in conformity to the dignity of the human person. Today, in fact, as a consequence of the possibilities which the state has for effectively preventing crime, by rendering one who has committed an offense incapable of doing harm, without definitely taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself, the cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity, quote, I think this is from Gospel of Life, are very rare, if not practically non-existent. We'll stop there if I read the revision. So how did you understand that passage in the Catechism prior to 2018?
Well, I take my first cue from, again, the Catechism of Trent, the Roman Catechism. Mm-hmm. I could read it if you like, or I don't have to, but it's pro death penalty. And I'll just characterize my position. What's happened in 97 and then more in 2018, according to me.
We'll get to let's save 2018 until we read it for people.
Sure.
But
with the movement of really the last, let's say 22 years in the church out of, again, 20 centuries, has been starting really with that revision by JP2 in 1997. There's a response. So there are two non-equal justifications for the death penalty in 3,000 years of moral reasoning about it. And one is a necessary justification for it, right? The principle of expiation. I have a great document by Pius XII on expiation, or some people call it retributivism. It's the principle by which the death penalty is licit. And I actually have a proof of this as well. But the second justification for the death penalty is the defense of self or others, which ends up sounding more like... it would make me ask Pope Francis or Pope John Paul II, is the death penalty an act of justice, which it's called several times in the history of, that's why I say it's a conditional good, or is it the principle of double effect? You deal with this, I think, effectively in your podcast. Principle of double effect is what you or I can do if some guy breaks in here with a gun.
Right.
We cannot intend to kill him, right, in strict Catholic moral philosophy. All we can intend to do is defend ourselves. The state holds something, this is even, evident in Christ's conversation with Pilate. The state holds something called prerogative, right? It can intend to kill prisoners. It can intend to kill them. And there are these two traditional justifications for it, very, very old, older than Christianity. One is expiation, the principle of retributivism. It's the necessary condition that must be there for there to be a second contingent reason, which is to defend self or others.
So you don't think, that's interesting you put it that way, and I don't want to get too far ahead of us. We'll get there eventually. Because traditionally through the history of the church, like if you look at St. Thomas Aquinas, he only offers one line of reasoning to defend the death penalty, and it's what you call that contingent reason, or for the common good.
Not in Summa Contra Gentiles. In Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas gives an utterly different account than the one that you
in the Summa Theologia.
He has two in the Summa Theologia, and he says in Summa Contra Gentiles, the fact that the evil ones, as long as they live, can be corrected from their errors, does not prohibit that they may be justly executed. For the danger which threatens them from their way of life is greater and more certain than the good expect from their improvement. So, let me continue.
The danger from their way of life to themselves or to others?
No, to the common good, which is inclusive not just of physical dangers, killing someone, because he's also talking about burning heretics,
right,
which plays an important role in this conversation. They're not murderers. They also have, at the critical point of death, the opportunity to be converted to God through repentance. If they are so obstinate that even at the point of death their heart does not draw back from malice, it is possible to make a quite probable judgment that they would never come away from evil. Now, a couple quick points here. These are not gotchas. It's just justification number one is the state holds the prerogative to kill on the principle of retributive expiation. It can't just be two alone, which is defending, innocent parties. And the reason that it can't be, well, I'm sure we'll talk about it as we get going, is because quite simply, two is contingent on one. In other words, and it's the only one that JP2 or Francis address is justification number 2. They seem to be trying to abrogate the church's teaching on justification number 2. They never touch the main one, which is justification number 1, meaning it's never been abrogated.
Well, they do say that. So let's go to the revision of the Catechism 2267, because we're talking about two reasons behind the death penalty: safeguarding the common good and the state's role in carrying out penal sanctions for a retributive kind of justice.
Well, common good touches both of them. The first justification is retributivism or expiation, as Pius XII calls it, the invisible principle. The second one is defense of, we should talk about three parties in society once we get into it, three parties that need to be defended by the death penalty.
All right, so here's the newer one. So let's see, we've got it right here. Okay, so the newer one post-2018.
Yep.
Is recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time, do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, so here the paragraph is building on, looks like three things: awareness of the dignity of the human person, new understanding of penal sanctions under the law, and the means to protect society. Consequently, the church teaches in the light of the gospel that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide.
Right. So see how the only thing being addressed there is protection. I mean, not the only topic, but the only justification being addressed here or in the later version is protection of self or others. Now, this is a strong claim, I know it. I'm not trying to be salty, but it's counterfactual to say that because of technological advances, persons no longer can be protected through this sole means. In other words, I would submit that in California, 73% of murderers will hit the streets again, and there's roughly a 10% recidivist rate. So you're talking about 7.3% of people that have murdered will hit the streets and murder again, irrespective of technological advances, right? So
are you talking about because they are released from prison?
Sure. So justification number 2 makes for the death penalty, which is ostensibly being being abrogated here, right, by I think 2 of the last 3 popes. Working in a kind of concert.
I would say from JP2 on, there's been a very vigorous push for worldwide abolition.
Agreed. 100%. But JP2 and Francis have only ever made this push on the base. They've only ever said, look, justification number 2 is no longer valid. There's always a vague, glancing blow reference to technological advances. I'm not sure what it is. They never say what it is, but I want to take them at their word and assess. Okay, there are 3 parties here that we could identify as being protected by the second justification. Now, the first justification is absolutely never abrogated, and it's the important one. I'm not.
What is that? The idea that those who commit certain crimes simply deserve death?
Sure. It's a desert argument, and it's the argument that needs to be there in order to get to the contingent second justification. In other words, take my numbers. This is a little more abstract than what we were talking about before. In California, 73% of murderers will hit the streets again, 3 out of 4. either because of short sentencing, liberal judges, or paroling, liberal judges. 30 of the 50 states parole.
Well, sometimes sometimes their sentences are overturned, or because they're exonerated. Or they're exonerated.
The 73% of convicted killers, 3 out of 4, will hit the streets.
But you could be exonerated. That would prove your conviction was not authentic first.
I was I'm a JD. That this never happens. It's lower than 1%. We're talking about 73% of. This is an LA Times article I'm citing. So, and I'm trying to make a point about the relationship between the necessary justification, expiation, retributivism, and the second justification, which the popes think they're abrogating here, defending people from murderers. So 73% of murderers will hit the streets again, and roughly 10% of those are recidivists, will murder again. So 7.3, let's just use this number, 7% of all murderers in the state of California will hit the streets and murder again, according to all the numbers. It's consistent with what I learned in criminal law. So what the popes are essentially saying, think about this, is the Aristotelian proposition called retorsion. I'm proving the first justification for the death penalty using the second one, proving that it's the necessary one. 7% of the population of murderers will endanger the population. And so allegedly the death penalty is justified killing 100% of of guilty parties, guilty murderers, before 2018, maybe 1997. According to the second justification, you can kill 100% of them just to get at the 7% that will be recidivists, right? This would be something like Catholic utilitarianism, which we can't allow.
I don't follow your argument here. You're saying that because it sounds like a common good argument that we need more rigorous death penalty because we can't contain
precisely. So that what I'm using is retorsion to show that unless there were this necessary justification for the death penalty, the first one, retributivism itself, which allows us to kill 100% of murderers, and the church has taught that, then you would become a common good arguer. You would become a kind of Catholic utilitarian by arguing only on the grounds of the second justification for the death penalty. Wait, just let me make this clear. So we're not allowed to do this as Catholics. This is my point. The second justification for the death penalty, which is treated by the recent popes as the unique justification for the death penalty.
You mean common good?
No. Common good applies to both of them.
Retributive.
No, defense.
Protection, defense. Defense and retribution.
Retribution is number one. The principle of expiation and retribution is number one. It's the invisible principle. It's necessary, and I'm showing that it exists. Number two is protecting. So if protecting the people in society from future murder, which is all JP2 or Francis ever address, justification number two, protection. If this were the only justification for the death penalty, which is how they treat it, then they would be engaging in a form of Catholic utilitarianism, which is not licit. We're not allowed to kill 100% of murderers in order to get at 7% of them. The reason that we could do this, kill 100% of murderers, is because there's an ontologically prior justification for the death penalty.
But here's my thing.
It's this here. It's Pius XII's justification for retributivism itself.
Right, but
that's a proof.
Right, but when you look at if it was purely desert in the sense that justice demands that these people be executed, you don't even need the common good argument, because you could just say, even if that's not necessary because justice just demands this. But here's where I'm not following your argument. One, I don't see the church ever teaching in a definitive way that there are certain crimes that deserve death, that would follow us throughout the rest of church history. And I think they are addressing this because in 2267 in the revision, it's talking about a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. People have seen that the state, that its role in carrying out justice does not have to focus on desert as much as protecting society and the rehabilitation of criminals. They're just saying that's not.
Read the next sentence.
Right. And lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed.
Right, that's the basis. I mean, that's the hinge of the argument is protection. It's always protection. In 97, it's protection.
But I would say that because it's also in the Catechism, it's under the section of legitimate defense. Like, people have the right to defend themselves, like just war.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So justification for death, this is a little more abstract, but justification for death penalty number 2, protecting innocent people, is the exact same right that a private citizen has. I mean, what Christ says to Pilate, right, in John's gospel, like, you have the power to kill me from above. That comes directly from my Father. That is called, in 3,000 years of philosophy, accepted by the church. That is called the prerogative of the state. If the state does not and has never killed, using the death penalty, on the sanction of double effect alone. That's what you and I hold. If some guy walks into this room with a gun, and I jump on him or you jump on him, and we end up killing him, that's the principle of double effect operating. This is not prerogative. We don't have the right to intend to kill him. The state, state holds the prerogative directly from God. I mean, I can get into the Magisteria on this, or Council of Trent on this.
Right, and this also
we should start there, so we're not just accused of starting in the last 22 years.
Right, but the thing here is, I would say that the church, and this is a disagreement we had in our previous conversation about feminism, and the question is, can the church change its teachings? And if something is not definitive, it's not infallible, it can be changed. I would say this is an issue of social doctrine that has changed. For example, there was a time where it was considered permissible to execute. Thomas talks about how maybe if you don't steal private property, you can't be executed, but if you steal public property or if you steal the sacrament, you can be executed. So executing heretics or thieves, and that was understandable because for a long time there were really no kinds of incarceration facilities. But as we've progressed, we've seen that the common good can be maintained without executing people of these particular crimes.
That's wild. I mean, though that's not the kind of development we'd expect to see from the church in regard to. No, I mean literally.
I'm trying to think. There's some
a pope anathema.
That's wild.
Well, I'm surprised. I'm surprised to hear you say that. The Catechism of Trent says this. Again, this prohibition does not apply to the civil magistrate, to whom is and they're talking about the mandate against murder,
right,
to whom is entrusted the power of life and death, by the legal and judicious exercise of which he punishes the guilty and protects the innocent. The use of the civil sword, when wielded by the hand of justice, because that's what the death penalty is the principle of justice, far from involving the crime of murder, is an act of paramount obedience to this commandment which prohibits murder. The end of the commandment is the preservation and security of human life, and to the attainment of this end, the punishments inflicted by the civil magistrate, who is the legitimate avenger of a crime, naturally tend, giving security to life by repressing outrage and violence. Hence these words of David, "In the morning I put to death all the wicked of the land, that might cut off all the workers of iniquity from the city of the Lord. In like manner, the soldier is guiltless who, actuated not by motives of ambition or cruelty, but put by a desire of serving the interests of his country." So it's clearly a principle of justice here. A
few thoughts I want to offer that. One, it seems that the Roman Catechism is talking about the principal aim of it is that it's for the protection of society. It says its legitimate end or aim is the protection of society. But I agree with you, there has to be a retributive element because, for example, people always say, well, you need the death penalty because some people, they'll still kill when they're in prison or this or that. You could come up with all kinds of unjust punishments that protect society. For example, you could say, all right, if you are convicted of murder and you're a double murderer, we're going to execute you and your family. And actually that would stop maybe a few murderers who love their families more than everybody else. If they know, they do this in North Korea. It's called the punishment of 3 generations. But we know, we can't punish innocent people, even if it helps to protect the common good. So there has to be something retributive about it, but its main aim is protecting the common good and protecting society.
Well, it depends what you mean main. It's not ontologically main. There's actually more than 2 justifications for the death penalty. But no, by adverting to justice, that the church is very clear that it's a principle of justice. It's an affirmative good to use the death penalty in these past magisteria on it. And the point is that it's a little abstract, but it's very, very important. It is a proof. It's a retorsion proof. you're getting it, but except I want to let the full implications sit. If the sole justification for the death penalty, making it licit allegedly until 2018, were to prevent dangers to innocent people,
right,
then you wouldn't be able to kill all 100% of the class of murderers, right? If you kill all 100% of the class of murderers to get at roughly 7%, that the numbers show will become recidivist. Would be, without a prior justification for it. You even acknowledge there's an element of retributivism. If the retributivism didn't make possible the killing of the 100% prior, ontologically, to the whatever good effect you're seeking out of it in a utilitarian way, then it would be tantamount to Catholic utilitarianism, right? Good and bad means.
I see the argument you're making now. What you're saying is that the state, it can't just be for protecting the common good, because there are people who will continue to reoffend. And so, we're trying that if only 7% of people are going to go on to murder again, there's 93% who won't.
Right.
But the reason for that is...
You'd be killing them unjustly if it's not just per se. So the first justification is...
No, but the reason to protect common
just
good,
per se.
even if they will never kill again, the problem is if you had if someone murders somebody and there's no punishment for them, no response to that at all, well, no one can feel safe, and then people could go on to commit those similar crimes. The fact that there's some punishment that is just will deter them, but we can disagree about what is the nature of that punishment, what should it be. I don't see any teaching in the church that says for particular crimes it has to be death.
No, we're not saying that it has to be death, but what? Okay, there's a few different ways to take it, because I do want to talk about. I want to take the popes, and maybe we can do this later. Take the popes at their own word and go on justification too. But my first point is that we're agreeing now. Then there is necessarily a previous justification for the death penalty, whether or not. The church never said that a state has to use it. Saying that a state can use it, a state has at its wherewithal always the moral capital on the basis of the first justification for the death penalty, called by Pius XII the principle of expiation, retributivism. It can kill 100% of murderers. Justification number 2 says, well, the reason you're doing this is to get at the 7% that will turn recidivist, right?
No, but there's more than that who would be a threat.
Here.
Even when you have all of this in place, this legal accoutrements and prisons and everything else, there's going to be more people besides that 7% who would commit a crime again if there were no punishment at all.
That doesn't matter. If the second, this shouldn't be that controversial. If the second justification for the death penalty, I'm not even sure you're saying that it is the sole justification for the death penalty. I didn't hear you saying that.
I say the primary aim.
I'm saying the popes, but okay, I don't know what primary means, but you seem to be acknowledging there are other justifications for the death penalty. One is necessary. This one is contingent. It's a contingent, a less important justification for the death penalty to say we are aiming, even if the recent popes talk more about it, we're aiming to prevent murder. We can kill to prevent murderers from killing again. That might be what you really care about personally in your heart, JP2 or Francis, but it would be unjust if there weren't a prior principle of actual justice, not just consequentialism, that makes ready, that avails us, that avails the state of killing. It's called the prerogative. That's why you can kill 100% of murderers to get to those 7%. Is that clear?
No, I see.
Or else it would be utilitarianism.
If there was no restrictions on what you did to promote the common good of society, you could do evil things to promote the common good. My point is that the desert or retributive element says that you have to operate within the bonds of justice, for example, only punishing the guilty, not the innocent, in order to preserve the common good, and that there are different means that can be deployed to be able to do this. Now, here's where it comes to death penalty. I was hoping I would resolve my position on this before we got here, but I haven't. I mean, one view, there's two views you could hold if you oppose the death penalty. You could hold, like E. Christian Brugger does and others, Tollefson, many others, that it's intrinsically evil. It is something that can never be done. And I'm actually very sympathetic to that view. The other view Well, I'll tell you why I'm sympathetic. The other view would be that it is something that becomes evil when you no longer have a justification, the primary justification to it, which is if you have bloodless means available that will get the job done, then, as JP2 says, the state will limit itself to that. You ought to choose those.
But that's only that second justification that's being addressed, right? If there's a bloodless means to protect society, but we're already saying that's fine. That's his personal preference. That might be what he really cares about is the protection. But listen to Pius XII on it, and I also already read the Catechism of Trent. This is a little lengthy, but it's right on point. He says, it remains to say a word about the ultimate meaning of punishment. Most modern theories of penal law explain punishment and justify it in the last resort as a protective measure, that is, a defense of the community against crimes being attempted, JP2 Francis, and at the same time as an effort to lead the culprit back to the observance of the law. In these theories, justification number 2, punishment may indeed include sanctions in the form of a diminution of certain advantages guaranteed by the law in order to teach the culprit to live honestly. But they fail to consider expiation of the crime committed, retributivism, which itself is a sanction on the violation of the law, as the most important function of the punishment. It may be permitted to a theory, to a juridical school, to national or international penal legislation to define philosophically punishment in the way which they understand it. So they don't have to. In conformity with their juridical system, provided that they respect the considerations developed above concerning the nature of man and the essence of guilt. But from another point of view, and indeed a higher one, this is where he says the higher justification is number 1. One may ask if the modern conception is fully adequate to explain punishment per se. The protection of the community against crimes and criminals must be ensured, but the final purpose of punishment must be sought on a higher plane. The essence of the culpable act is the free opposition to a law recognized as binding. It is the rupture and deliberate violation of just order. Once done, it is impossible to recall. Nevertheless, insofar as it is possible to make the satisfaction for the order violated, that should be done. For this is a fundamental exigency of justice. Right. Principle 1, whose role in morality is to maintain the existing equilibrium, if it is just, and to restore the balance when upset. Not the balance of protection, but the balance of justice, right, which is the highest form of the common good. Common good is not just protection, that's the lowest form. It demands that by punishment, the person responsible be forcibly brought to order, and the fulfillment of this demand proclaims the absolute supremacy of good over evil, so it's invisible. Right triumphs sovereignly over wrong. Let us take the last step. In the metaphysical order, the punishment is a consequence of our dependence on the supreme will, a dependence which is inscribed indelibly on our created nature. If it is ever necessary to repress the revolt of a free being and reestablish the broken order, then it is surely here when the supreme judge and his justice demand it. The victim of an injustice may freely renounce his claim to reparation, but as far as justice is concerned, it is always assured to him. This more profound we're getting into the meat of it here. Sorry,
we're getting into an audiobook here.
Sorry, it's so long, but it's exactly
right,
what I was saying. I only found this morning. Can I finish the last? Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I had
my highlights are here, but none of it makes sense without that.
My point is just, I think we agree agree that. There you go. We agree that I think we agree that punishment has 3 elements to it: protection, retribution, and rehabilitation.
Well, there's more than that. There's according to most legal theorists in law school, there's like 5.
Yeah, I mean, deterrence can be under that. Sure, but here's my thing. Even given all of that, though, there's nothing in natural law or in the teaching of the magisterium that mandates for a punishment to be just, to protect society, or to mete out justice, that it must include a specific kind of punishment, whether that be death, torture, whatever it may be. People can come to a better understanding of what kind of punishments are necessary to mete out justice and protect the common good. So you and I think we would see now, I mean, do you think that the execution of a thief, like, is that just or it's unjust? Like, you can have punishments that are far too severe, right?
Well, sure. That is the dictate, Trent, of the natural law, is that the Pope's not saying, and I'm not saying, anything about the status of polities that don't use the death penalty. That's not the point. The dictate of natural law is precisely in proportionalism, or what Aristotle and Thomas call geometric proportion rather than arithmetic proportion. It means If you're owed more, you get more. It's not perfect arithmetic equality. If you're owed less, you get less. It's the principle we call proportionalism that is that first principle of justice. This is the fundamental, the innermost idea of justice that's invisible in the way that Pius XII is saying. There are 4 or 5 theories for the justification of punishment if you go to law school. 3 of them are primary for Catholics, like you said. But there is one primary one necessary one, that makes all the other ones possible. And so when Francis and JP2 get rolling here on the death penalty, and we're really only talking about the last 20 years, they're only addressing one of the contingent justifications for punishment. It's, hey, let's talk about how they think, and I think this is quite demonstrably wrong. We can talk about that maybe afterwards on justification number 2. They think that now technology has availed society of a better means of punishing and still keeping safe society. They never once address retributivism itself or expiation.
I think they do address it, because the main thing, and this is from...
Well, it's unchanging, so they couldn't say it changes. Geometric proportions.
What changes?
1 is to 2 as 2 is to 4. That cannot change. That's the principle of justice itself.
You're talking that more severe crimes deserve more severe punishment.
Writ large justice. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, but
desert.
Yes, but here's
this
the thing.
is what makes it possible. In other words, even in that case where you say, I don't like the death penalty, like JP2 said, but I'm going to go along with it as long as it's defending other people, and we can say that until technology changes it where there are better means.
But my point is,
what makes it possible to do is the principle of justice.
My point is, though, you would not need that secondary. You don't need the common good protection, even if it had no effect whatsoever on the common good.
Justice is part of the common good, though.
Right. Well, or protection. Even if it had no deterrent effect, it had no difference. You could just rely on this purely retributive argument and say, well, they just deserve the death penalty because justice demands it. But I don't see that either from natural law or the church teaching.
Well, it's part of natural. It's book 5 of the Ethics.
But Aristotle says that, and Aquinas follows him on this, that the natural law does not prescribe particular minimums for punishments. It prescribes maximums.
I'm not talking about a minimum. I'm not talking about a minimum. I'm just saying to each his due. And again, I don't know why the emphasis would be on minimums. We're not dealing with this worldwide situation where popes are criticizing countries for not using harsh enough punishments.
Right, but
we're working in the opposite.
If there are states that determine, the point being that the state says that for certain crimes, there is no crime that requires the death penalty as a minimum punishment. It seems to me the state has the right, if it wants to fashion a law like that, to be able to do that, as long as it has punishments that protect the common good of society. So when it comes to retributivism, you could say, look, our theory of justice is that the most severe crimes deserve the most severe punishment. So you could cap that most severe punishment wherever you want, and you still have retributive justice here. I
have no problem with that. But I'm saying something you said earlier that I felt I should have pounced on is the crime of heresy. It's anathematized in 1520 as Luther was anathematized. The Pope says, let him be anathema who says that we can't burn heretics. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I agree. It sounds strange, even to my American Catholic ears, to say, use the death penalty on heretics. But I'm saying it doesn't violate that first justification to burn heretics because that's a kind of, spiritual murder, which is more important than bodily murder. Whatever the case. Yeah, you're getting caught up on, do all countries have to use the death penalty? No. But the first justification for it, the geometric principle of justice itself, not some comely consequence that we want, like protecting society, which we really do need to talk about. That's all they talk about. But the principle itself is eternal. It's perennial. It's pre-Christian, right?
It seems to me that the previous, because what you cited from Pope Pius XII was talking about punishment in general. Let's go back to Aquinas.
No. So this is the point where can I finish the last paragraph? He gets to the death penalty. These reflections, he was waxing philosophical here. These reflections help to a better appreciation of another age, which some regard as outmoded, which distinguished between medicinal punishment and vindicative punishment. In vindicative punishment, the function of expiation, first justification, is to the fore. The function of protection is comprised in both types of punishment. Canon law, as you know, still maintains the distinction, which attitude is founded on the convictions already detailed. Only it gives full meaning to the well-known word of the apostle in the epistle to the Romans, 13, verse 4. It is not for nothing that he bears the sword. He is God's minister still to inflict punishment upon the wrongdoer. Here it is expiation which is brought out. So Pius XII is saying expiation is the main principle Paul's bringing out in Holy Scriptures. Finally, it is only the expiatory function which gives the key to the last judgment of the Creator himself. This is really the connection between heaven and rule on earth, what we call prerogative, what the state holds that you or I don't, who the Creator renders to everyone according to his works, as both testaments often repeat. The function of protection disappears completely in the afterlife, so there's no protection in the afterlife, but justice remains. The omnipotent and all-knowing Creator can always prevent the repetition of a crime by the interior moral conversion of the delinquent, but the supreme judge in his last judgment applies uniquely the principle of retribution. This, then, must be of great import. Whether or not, as we've said, one leaves to theory and practice the duty of defining the role of punishment in the narrower modern sense, or in the broader one, it is possible for collaboration in either sense, and one can look forward to the creation of an international penal code, but do not refuse to consider this ultimate reason for punishment merely because it does not seem likely to produce immediate practical results.
Okay, but even in that, in his address to the jurors in 1953 or 1954, when he was commenting on Romans 13:4, which is a passage that comes up all the time in this debate.
Of course it does.
Because Paul says, he's talking about the legitimate authority of rulers to punish the population. We all agree with that. And I think everyone in this debate would agree that rulers have an obligation to protect society, to protect the common good, and they have means at their disposal to do that, including means of legal punishment. However,
common good includes justice, though. It's not just this reductive material.
No, it does include justice. But Pope Pius XII, in talking about Romans 13:4, and that verse in particular, he says that verse, it does not refer to the concrete contents of individual juridical prescriptions or rules of actions.
Of course, because they're prudential, and he doesn't want to weigh in on them.
Right. So,
but he's saying the death penalty is a good that can be used. It's on the table.
Right, and that's his interpretation of it, but that's not necessarily, we don't have to say that Romans 13:4 has this kind of binding understanding the state must always be able to execute criminals. In fact, I don't even read this from the passage myself, that because the one thing that people, here, I'll tell you why. So it says, I'll read it to you, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer." Now, the Greek word here is the makero. It refers to like a short dagger a Roman soldier would carry on his side. But that wasn't what was used for execution. In fact, the sword itself in ancient Rome was primarily, if it was used to execute, it was for the upper class. You know, if you were, most Romans, it's interesting enough, the upper class preferred to be beheaded than to be confined to a magistrate's house for the rest of their lives.
Sure.
The most common executions were thrown from great height, drowning, animals. My favorite one is thrown in a bag with snakes and then into a river. So, you know, that here...
That's how I'm going to go, man.
Right. I would take this to mean, if you made... Christian Brugger offers this example, and I think it's correct. It'd be like saying, look, you're a Christian, but you still live in America. Don't go around breaking the laws, because a cop doesn't carry a gun just for show. But cops don't execute people with their guns. It's that the state has the right to use legal means to suppress and punish people.
But the sword, particularly in the realm of politics, this comes from further back than Magna Carta. There are two hands of the state, the purse and the sword. The sword always represents the prerogative, which includes...
Of punishment.
It's inclusive of but punishment always included capital offenses in America.
Sure.
In even the early... 1900s, a capital offense was far more inclusive than people making anti-death penalty arguments would be comfortable with. It was inclusive of more than just murder. So yes, the tradition. I mean, you have to pick a position here. Either the church is changing the moral law and the natural law on this, because the world used to be utterly comfortable with the death penalty, and naturally the emphasis was on the first justification for it, that it's not unjust. At any time, in any age, even if you have the world's best prisons all over the place, which we don't have, people. I mean, there are three parties in society that deserve protection: the prisoners themselves, who simply do not make conversions when they serve out life sentences. They're 7 to 8 times more likely to do an act of contrition on death row. That is a unique function of the common good that the death penalty serves. That's never going to be outmoded. Thomas talks about it in Fazer and Bassett's book. They produce these numbers. Party number 2, real fast, that's due protection, you already mentioned this, are nonviolent criminals who are in prison. They, if they're just in a prison with violent murderers, and the violent murderers can never be punished worse than life imprisonment, they're killed routinely. Hundreds of prisoners around the world are killed in prisons. Look at Russia's the world's most dangerous prisons. And number 3, this is all on justification number 2 itself. The common people, the law-abiding citizens, deserve protection. If we take JP2 and Francis at their word here, then they would have to be guaranteeing that no prisoners, for any reason or another, due to technology, can ever get out again and harm again. It's not only technological prisons. If they're released, 4 of them will be in the state of California, and they have a 10% recidivism rate, then they're wrong. They're counterfactual, JP2 and Francis, even on the strength of justification number 2,
but even
let alone 1,
given that our
again.
Concerns about, which sounds to me like it's a consequentialist argument, where concern about
2 is.
Right.
2 is.
But even that, you're going to have trade-offs here, because you can't do things, and this is where I would say this is not purely a prudential judgment. It's talking about in the light of the gospel, and particularly going to John Paul II about how a murderer does not lose his dignity. That is, to me, a rebuke of Thomas's primary argument for the death penalty, which we can get into here in a second.
But dignity, the death penalty isn't a breach of dignity as it's defined as a theological.
No. I'll explain what I meant by that with Thomas's argument.
Yeah, I think.
But when you go to that, the reason you're talking about here, in order to truly protect people, you would have to do, like, when you look at what happens to people on death row.
But protection is a consequentialist argument, real fast.
It is, but
that's not the main reason.
It can cut both ways. That execution is the third most likely thing to happen to someone on death row. Their conviction is either overturned, they die there, they're released, or they're exonerated. So in order,
executions are very rarely overturned. Death sentences are very, very rarely overturned.
I've read a statistic that said 60 to 70% of them are overturned.
Wrong. No, that's wrong. A death row inmate gets either an appellate decision or whatever. It doesn't matter.
People will be on death row for what? They could be on average 15 years, 20 years.
Which is wrong. It should be swift. It's part of justice. They should be executed.
But then here's the trade-off then. As you do that to protect the common good, you could do all sorts of things to make sure the guilty are punished, but then you inflate the risk of punishing the innocent. You would agree. I mean, you understand law. Our law is based on the principle we shape the law so that a benefit is given to the guilty. It's more likely a guilty person will go free than an innocent person will be punished.
Of course.
And that's a good thing.
Well, this is because of motions to strike. Even when a case goes to trial, the criminal, any criminal lawyer will tell you this, guilty, 98% of the time, literally. If it gets past the motions to strike phase, right? I mean, summary judgment phase of court. Criminal trials, you're looking at a guilty man 98% of the time. That's before the exigencies of due process. The criminal justice system works. It works really well. That doesn't mean there hasn't been one case of a person that's been fined $15 unjustly, put away for 50 years unjustly,
people have been executed
or executed unjustly. It matters not. If that argument that liberals have made, that's an argument against punishment.
I agree that's a bad argument. I totally agree to say, well, innocent people be executed. Sure, innocent people can be punished, though I think it has a bit of merit in that even in lengthy prison sentences, justice can be restored to the individual. You can give them their life back. You can give people their property back. With death, it takes on a different gravity, though, because you can't undo that injustice.
But Trent, justice is an invisible principle of the natural law. Justice, we're not talking about restorative justice. We're talking about proportional justice, or retributivism or expiation itself. We're not even talking about giving the goods back, serving time. We're talking about and this is what's so dignified about the death penalty. This is why Francis operates on like so many things, a pop culture sense of dignity rather than the sense of dignity that comes uniquely from Catholic teaching, which is all about being made in the image and likeness of God. His dignity is his intellect and his will, and him being brought to conversion. Like how do you deal with this? Joe Bassett crunches the numbers. 7 to 8 times, not percent, but times more murderers, convicted murderers who have gone through due process, that are on death row, will make an act of contrition and maybe eventually wind up in heaven than those.
All he says is that they say sorry, they're contrite in some form.
No. It's an act from sorry, beginning contrition. Most of them aren't Catholics, so it's imperfect. But you and I believe we believe that there's a possibility for people outside of the sacraments, Protestants or whatever, to somehow, we don't know how, get to heaven, but not without at least an imperfect act of contrition. 7 to 8 times more likely on death row when they know an expiration date than, on the other hand, when they just serve life sentences. 7 to 8 times less. That's a huge number, and that is a huge strike for the dignity of the death penalty, which shouldn't be thrown into question.
Well, that's the dignity of allowing someone to have an opportunity to be able to repent, to treat them with dignity in that regard.
The opportunity is presented by the expiry date. But it's not a question of time.
It is a good consequence that emerges from these situations, but an unjust act isn't justified by good consequences.
So this is what I'm saying.
But with dignity, it's not just Francis.
We're on consequentialist. Yeah. We're on justification 2 now. Justification number 1, we were agreeing. That's always there.
About protecting... No, you mean retribution.
Common good is both. Yeah, retributivism is the principle of justice number 1. Pius XII here, and I showed at the very beginning through a kind of a retortive proof, it always has to be there, or else we wouldn't be able to kill anyone.
But you haven't shown that. Well, what do you? I don't understand. Just because only some small
justification number 2 does not stand on its own. It would not, if it were an act of injustice, which is I didn't think you were saying this in your podcast. You sound like you're saying it now, but I might be hearing you wrong. I didn't think you thought it was unjust. The death penalty has to be per se just as an act of justice, or else you could not do it as an expiatory act. You couldn't do it for justification number 2 just to get at 7% of the population that once they hit the streets will turn recidivist. That would be consequentialism, right? So that proves that justification number 2 is contingent, and it's always ordered back to justification number 1. Why do I bring this up? Because the recent popes that got a bee in their bonnet about the death penalty after several thousand years of its justice, they only try to abrogate justification number 2. They do. That's all they address is, well, technology. They never say exactly what the technology is.
But even when you look at Thomas's defense of the death penalty, it does not rest on the idea that, well, the state can execute people because certain kinds of crimes deserve death. Because he has a problem with
Summa contra gentiles does.
No, I mean, I'll look at the text again. That's not what I'm seeing. It says the fact that the evil ones, as long as they live, can be corrected from their errors does not prohibit that they may be justly executed for the danger which threatens from. So it's not saying.
Reread sentence 1 though. Because he's saying precisely because there might be popes like Francis or JP2 that amble along, in the 20th or 21st century and say, well, we have good enough prisons now. That doesn't mean that justice isn't the first dictate.
Right. It is just because they have committed a crime worthy of punishment, and punishment is the means that, because he says the connecting clause, the danger which threatens from their way of life is greater and more certain than the good which may be expected from their improvement. He's making the recidivism argument you're making. He's not making that it's just because they deserve death for their crimes.
No, he's not. He's not.
It's just because they pose a danger to society.
Where do you get that?
The danger.
I have the quote right here.
Yeah,
Let me look at it.
For the danger which threatens from their way of life.
This means to the common good, not just to safety. Common good is everything from. Well, common good is well defined in the Catholic tradition. It means safety at the bodily safety and integrity at the very bottom, spiritual health at the very top, and somewhere in the middle, natural law justice. Well, so he means the infectious danger of having someone around to themselves and others, spiritually as well as physically.
Because they've murdered, they could do this again. That's the danger, right?
No.
What danger is he talking about?
That's the lowest danger, right? Because Thomas is also talking about executing heretics, which is just.
Right, because of the danger they pose to society.
Right, but they don't pose a. Sure.
So that's why he says he says you can execute a thief who steals public property, but not a thief who steals private property, even though they're both guilty of the sin of theft, because one's a danger to the common good.
But I'm not trying to cut you off. It's just it's very clear. He's saying it clear as day. The fact that evil ones, as long as they live, might be able to, JP2 Francis, be corrected from their errors, does not prohibit their just execution, meaning it's a principle of just execution to execute, because justice is this principle of expiation.
But it's not. But that's not expiation he's talking about here. He's talking about protection, because what he's saying is,
not expiation in the
they
sense
could
of
repent in the future, but there's also a high probability that they won't, and people shouldn't be subjected to that danger from them.
He's saying the danger that is posed to the common good, which is spiritual danger. It's a danger to the natural virtue of justice, right? When people see people getting away with things, justifications we haven't yet talked about. And then the bodily danger. All I'm saying that I don't see how anyone disagrees with when it's laid out like this is the popes only address one kind of danger. They set it up to knock it down. The latter two popes, I mean, not Pius XII. They only say one kind of danger, bodily danger, by murderers to other people. Thomas is talking about many more forms. I don't agree with the popes because so many people are paroled in California or have short sentences, and recidivism rates are so high. Forget that. We'll talk about that after. The point is, Thomas is saying, as Pius XII was saying, as the Catechism of Trent was saying, it's always just as long as the punishment is proportional. That's the invisible geometrical principle.
He agrees that it has to be proportional, but Thomas never, go to the Summa Theologia, he never makes an argument that the justification for the death penalty is because death is proportional for certain crimes. He doesn't do that.
It's implicit.
What he offers is this. He offers an analogy. He says that just as you can cut off a gangrenous limb to protect the body, you can the state can cut off a murderer to protect society, but then
some sin. He says some.
Or some.
Sin.
Yeah,
he doesn't even say.
But
murderer.
Notice what we're doing here. That's still a development. We can develop on our understanding of how the death penalty should be applied, and maybe if it should be applied. Sure,
not contradict, but develop.
Well, I think Thomas might find it to be quite a contradiction that we don't execute heretics anymore.
No, because that's the part that Phaser's really effective in talking about in his book. That's a prudential judgment. The popes were never saying, Trent, and Thomas and Augustine, who loves the death penalty, they were never saying that it's some sellout by the state to the church if the state chooses not to use the death penalty.
I would say, I got a citation here. I would not say that Augustine loves the death penalty.
He embraces it warmly.
He also pled for clemency for people. He talks about how our desire, rather, is that justice be satisfied without the taking of lives or the maiming of bodies in any part. He understands how the state has the need to protect the common good of society. The state needs to administer justice. But even here, he's preferring and asking for a means of doing it that doesn't involve shedding blood. And that's actually very common in the early church before Christians are
in some cases it can. That's prudential. That's really off that we're not debating that.
Let's go back to Thomas.
Okay, but first, Augustine also says, quickly, the same divine authority that forbids the killing of a human being establishes certain exceptions, as when God authorizes killing by general law, or when he gives an explicit commission to an individual for a limited time. God could not, by general law, do the unjust, Trent. And you know this is true.
But
can
God
an act of justice then, if the death penalty is an act of justice, which all of these sources are pointing us to, can an act of justice be a breach against human dignity, the way Francis is saying?
Yes, it can be. Well, that's
how.
But that's what JP2 also says, that the killer, even a murderer, does not lose their personal dignity. What Augustine is saying there is
theologically
that
wrong.
You and I, we cannot kill civilians in war, but God could command the Israelites to lay waste to the Amalekites because God has the authority over life and death. And just
how?
What do you mean how?
On what justificational basis? I love that.
That God has. Well, God created life. He creates life. He has the right to take it.
Right?
Yes. But that does not mean that because
but you and I can kill in war, right? If it's a just war.
We can't slaughter.
Right, we can't do that. We can't.
Even though God commanded. Now, I don't think he actually did that in my book, Hard Sayings. I talk about how I think there's other ways to read the passage. But even if he did, that wouldn't prove that the Bible is immoral, because God could have killed those people with a plague, for example, or he could deputize the Israelites to carry that out. But God has neither specifically said to any governments, you must retain the death penalty, nor has he given us a general.
That's not the claim, though.
Or has he given us a general law saying it should be retained.
That's not the debate. No one is debating. I think you know it. No one is debating for the second time now that all nations on earth must use the death penalty. It's the opposite.
You're saying the church shouldn't tell people they ought to abolish it.
Yes, the church is in no position to tell people they ought to abolish it, because the first justification is an unchanging principle. It's a geometric principle.
But that principle doesn't come either from natural law or from the teaching of the church. But Thomas, now we're back at Thomas. This is good. In the Summa Theologia, Thomas never appeals to that. He offers the argument that you could cut off a diseased limb to protect the body. And then he says, because when he's talking about double effect, he's saying you can't directly intend the death of a person, of a human being. That's why
a human can't. The state can. The state can. That's called. Jesus says
he
this.
doesn't. What he
Jesus
says
it to
he
Pilate.
doesn't. He doesn't say that, because he says in the Summa Theologia, he says the reason the state can execute a criminal is because that person, because they've committed such a severe sin, they have departed from the order of reason and lowered themselves to the level of the beasts. And so here he's saying that people essentially lose their personal dignity because of their crimes.
He doesn't say dignity, though.
Well, he says that they no longer have the same standing among other human beings. They've been lowered to the level of the beasts. And just as you can kill an ornery beast that you don't need around anymore, that same treatment can be given to criminals. But that's why John Paul II says no, reflecting on how God spared Cain, and also I'd say how God spared Moses after he killed the Egyptian, that even a murderer does not lose that personal dignity.
But we've talked about so many passages here that say, sure, God can spare people. Individual polities can spare people and not use the death penalty. That's not at question. Once again, what's at issue is, let's read Thomas again. The fact that evil ones, as long as they live, can be corrected from their danger. This fact does not prohibit that they may be justly executed. Right, that's what's at issue, because that is what I think very fairly characterized as the emphasis of Francis and JP2. Right, the contingent justification. You want to focus on the most reductive version of the common good, which is just protecting other people. That would essentially say the reason this is so important, this debate, is because not just in Catholic theology, but in philosophy that the Catholic Church has subsumed, natural law philosophy, the reason to punish cannot be reduced to consequentialism. We don't accept this.
You can also have this. It's completely coherent to say a person deserves punishment for his or her crimes, and the most severe crimes deserve the most severe punishment. And you could fashion a framework around that doesn't require the death penalty. And if you see the death penalty as something that is unjust, because as Brugger and Tollefson and others will argue,
it's not unjust. It's been called just in. I mean, yeah, Brugger, Tollefson, the new natural law guys, they have a bee in their bonnet with look, all of the scripture passages, Paul, Genesis chapter 9, the Noahide covenant has in the covenant, never abrogated. I know it's Old Testament, but this is a covenant that's binding on the Jews and the Muslims as well, right? It says, by man shall his blood be shed. This is a never abrogated universal covenant.
But
Paul loves it. Jesus says to Pontius Pilate, you have the power to kill, and it comes from God. That is the most apropos definition of prerogative. No, the power that the state holds, the sword, that neither you and I hold even or execute if someone breaks into the room and we kill him. That's double effect.
No, I'll offer responses to all three of those verses. First, I think I pointed back to Pope Pius XII saying that Romans 13, even from his understanding, does not refer to concrete juridical applications about what it means for the state to exercise its ability to punish. The second one,
I didn't say it did.
The second from John 19:11, that Jesus acknowledges that Pilate, that he has authority. The point here, he's not, I would not say he's making any kind of a statement about the death penalty, whether it's legitimate or not, whether it can never be abolished in the future. He's just saying that Pilate is trying to vaunt his own authority, say, I have this authority.
He says the power to kill you.
Yeah, I have the power to release
that. It's quell.
He says
it's indexical. He says that power comes from my Father. You wouldn't have it unless he wanted you to have it.
But God can permit the rulers of those who are Christian and those who are not Christian to have authority to do things that may not be just, such as using the death penalty in unjust ways.
We know it's just. The principle of the death penalty, as long as you have the right man you're fingering. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that Jesus was the right man. It's specifically just. We've already demonstrated
John
that
19,
here today.
He's saying that's
we
why
agreed about it.
He's making the point that Pilate is being manipulated by other people, that he has authority to carry out punishment.
Sure.
The one who handed me over to you is the one who adds the greater sin. That's the point
I'm
he's
not
making.
quibbling with you. I'm just saying it's an ancillary issue. Jesus, the Roman Empire, executed people in horrible ways. Jesus had no problem with it, and he is acknowledging something that in the history of philosophy political philosophy we call the prerogative. And the church acknowledges it everywhere. Pius XII is very, very specific here.
And
the Catechism of Trent is very specific. The state holds a power directly given to it by God called the prerogative, where they hold the sword in a way that if something horrible happened to one of our family members, I'm the kind of guy I would want retribution. It's not available to me, right? It's available to the state,
right?
Justly, because of the principle of justice. Now, can we talk for a second about
Can I reply to Genesis 9 because you brought it up?
Yeah.
Okay. First, we have to be careful when we're taking these passages to understand how has the magisterium understood it, how has it applied them.
Obviously.
And I've never seen Genesis 9 used in a magisterial text to say that the death penalty can never be abolished or that the death penalty is something that must always perdure. I mean, when you look at the Catechism, the new revision, it admits that it was long held to be acceptable to use the death penalty to safeguard society and to promote justice. But even when it comes to Genesis 9, we had people like Pope Benedict XVI who cites it in one of his documents saying that, God doesn't want people to kill. Let's read Genesis 9. The passage you're thinking about is, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image.
That's a stronger claim than I've even made.
You could read it as a command, or you could also read it. You could read it as a proverb, as in this is what's going to happen to you.
But either way, I'm just jumping in here. Either way, what it's not leaving logically available is the idea that the death penalty as a natural law principle is somehow wrong. It's not. Whether God's saying you must use the death penalty, which it sounds a lot like he's saying, or he's just saying it proverbially as your
if you kill others, people are going to kill you.
No. Read it again. Read it again. That's not what. That's not any interpretation of that.
It can be read as a proverb.
No, if you kill others, then by man's blood, by man's hand shall your blood be shed. And he's saying this is an affirmative principle of justice, right? He's putting this forward as. Let's have can you read the passage once?
He says, there's other stuff. Verse that talks about here how you should not drink blood, for example, of an animal's life. That's been rescinded. Of course. Since.
Of course. That's all Council of Jerusalem stuff. Death penalty's not.
And be fruitful and multiply is after that. It's just this one verse. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. Now, when Pope Benedict refers to this passage, important. He talks about how Cain was preserved. He cites thou shalt not kill. And then he cites how in Genesis 4, how God protected Cain from being killed. And he said, God wants life, not death. He forbids all killing, even of those who kill. And St. Ambrose, also reflecting on these passages, said that God preferred the correction rather than the death of a sinner. He did not desire that a homicide be punished by the exaction of another homicide.
Of course. God wants the best for us, right? But except that doesn't mean that he wants the best for us to the detriment of widespread, the widespread abolition of justice in the case of all murderers, right? Which is what we're agreeing now. The first justification for the death penalty is it's constitutive of geometric justice.
But there's
proportional justice.
But where does the church? Well, where does the church teach, or the church teaches this, or natural law teaches it, that justice requires the death penalty? So there's two elements here where we might be disagreeing about. Let me finish. One would be whether the death penalty is wrong and whether it's obligatory. One could say, well, we don't need this anymore. I guess you could still choose to do it, but that might be wrong to do if you don't have if you don't have a moral justification for doing it. But I don't see that in natural law why we can't say the most severe punishments for the most severe crimes, you don't have to have death in there. And the church never says anything like that. Why? I mean,
we're debating Francis and JP2, I think, and them saying that it's unjust, that it violates dignity. This is theologically wrong. I will say that here today. It's theologically wrong.
Have there been
it's inadmissible?
Have there been
That's what we're debating.
Have there been punishments the church understood were just in the past, said they were, even said that they were good, but we now recognize that they were unjust or violated people's dignity? The use of torture in medieval Europe, the use of the death penalty for what we now consider very minor crimes. Those would be examples of injustice.
But you're failing to distinguish. If there are instances of where the church had not condemned them harshly enough in history, and then later it said we're condemning, they're condemning on the basis of we need to correct. This is out of accord with geometric justice. That's precisely why what we're debating is the fact that the church can never say, irrespective of which countries use it, they're not telling us what to do. The church doesn't get into disposing of justice that way. All it's saying is that one can never set the death penalty against justice. It is the perfectly proportional juridical measure as against something like murder. Or the church also said, I told you the document.
But that's more of a modern development because I asked people online, I thought about following this up. I asked people what crimes deserve the death penalty? If we're so sure about that, people seem to have even a lot of disagreement here. My fact of the matter is if there are a set of crimes and that set seems to increase throughout history that we see are not deserving of death, it's possible we could say that for all crimes, just like we say that for torture.
That doesn't follow.
Why not?
That's a fallacy. Because, for one thing, you're not using an absolute marker to define what would be justice. We always know the principle of justice mandates geometric proportion, right? Expiation. So and the popes recently, this is kind of convenient, are only addressing these people as if they would be murderers. So let's stick to the realm of murder because I will say that the church cannot...
let me ask, I have a question. What principle do we use to determine what crimes are worthy of death? What moral principle do we follow?
Geometric justice. The principle of natural law.
All that means is more severe crimes deserve more severe punishment.
That
doesn't tell us enough.
No, it doesn't. No, it tells us a lot. It tells us a lot. For one thing, it is prudential, right? The state, since it holds prerogative, always 100% perennially acknowledged in the Christian tradition, the state has the prudential judgment, unless they're grossly violating geometrical proportion. Geometrical proportion means it's got to be a serious crime. Thomas and Augustine were living in a time when they were assuming, serious crime like heresy, this warrants death. I have no problem with that, but except it's not realistic in a secular republic like ours, right? So what people by and large are talking about is death penalty
also
for
because
killing.
we
by man's shall his blood be shed. We're talking about Scripture, the Noahide covenant.
Right, but that's not necessarily something that's not what we have to look at what the church teaches on this subject.
Well, I am. I read you Catechism of Trent, right? I mean, the church teaches very clearly that the prohibition against murder does not apply to the civil magistrate,
but
not individual citizens. Because of this thing Jesus talked about with Pilate, the prerogative of the state, to whom the civil magistrate, to whom is entrusted the power of life and death.
Right.
This has never been questioned until 30 years ago, and you want the church to follow suit down that rabbit hole. I can't get there. By the legal and judicious exercise of which he punishes the guilty and protects the innocent. The power of life and death. So what they mean by legal and judicious is you shouldn't be a kangaroo court, right? Shouldn't be a midnight jury. It should be what we call, and there's a long history of this emanating the last 1,000 years out of Magna Carta, procedural due process, right? It's got to be fair, jury of your peers.
Right. Everybody agrees on that.
I think so. So I don't understand.
And the church acknowledges there was a time where death could be carried out because it was seen as the only remedy, as what was necessary to protect society. Just the same way as
That's
it was
justification too, though. So we're back on that.
But justification 1 does not entail that crimes must be punished with death or else justice isn't served. It just entails that
the opposite.
It just entails the guilty must be punished.
No, justification number 1 is the interior principle of justice, that if you take something, it can be taken back. If you take a life, it can be taken from you. No Noahide covenant, right? It's supernatural, but it's also natural. It's geometric proportion. That's what makes it even possible, as I've said several times here today, for popes JP2 and Francis to reason about the good consequences, which is never why you can't do an ill act to get a good consequence. It has to be a good act, the death penalty. That's why they can even reason about, well, protection. We protect lives. That's why I like the death penalty. That's why I say the death penalty is okay. That might be JP2's personal preference or Francis's personal preference, but that would be Catholic consequentialism unless the death penalty were, for at least murder, justice per se.
Justice is served because it's seen as a means that a person deserves death. But you could say also that it was done unjustly throughout church history. You could say that just like other things were done unjustly, like the holding of slaves or penalizing those who charge interest on loans. I know you don't like when I've brought that up before, but the church has grown its understanding of these separate issues.
I'm just saying I don't mind it a bit. It's an argument by analogy when it does far better to get into the real meat and potatoes of this. I gave you a modal proof that there has to be, and you accepted, there have to be multiple justifications for this. In any case where there's multiple justifications, one is necessary, the others are contingent upon it.
All it shows is that a person must be guilty of a crime if they are to be punished to protect the common good.
No, it shows that the crime must be proportional to the
punishment must be proportional to the crime.
They must enjoy mutual proportionality. So let's do this. Let's examine the parties. Let's examine. Okay, I don't know how you ever get to a position reasonably that the principle of justice itself violates justice. The death penalty itself violates justice because it's justified on that first principle.
You could just say that a person has life is a basic good of an individual. And so if we are called to love our neighbor means to will the good for an individual. If we were to will the good for someone, we have to will something for them. And the most basic good of theirs we can will is the very life that they have.
Heaven, the novissimi, the four last things, soteriologically. What we're really
Heaven
hoping,
is only something, you can't get that by death, you get that by conversion.
Look, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with it? No, I'm not saying you get it by death, but what we have are facts and figures. Thomas Aquinas said, they also have at the critical point of death, the guilty, the opportunity that they wouldn't otherwise have to be converted to God through repentance. If they are so obstinate that even at the point of death, they don't draw back from malice, it's possible to say they wouldn't otherwise do it. Now,
they would have
Thomas Aquinas
the opportunity. This wouldn't have much motivation.
Okay, so you disagree with Thomas there. But Joe Bassett crunched the numbers, right? What's wrong with this reasoning? So I think we've proven there is another justification, a more fundamental one. But let's take the popes at their word here on the death penalty. They say, okay, it's about protection of life for others, and including the person themselves, the guilty party.
Yeah, they still
protecting
have dignity.
Their soul.
It's not lost.
7 to 8. Yeah, of course, it's never lost. They're a human being. It can't be lost whether you kill them, whatever.
That's not what, and that disagrees with Thomas. What he argues.
No. Thomas doesn't use the term dignity, man. It disagrees with Francis. I'm very comfortable disagreeing with Pope Francis.
I think
I'm not comfortable disagreeing with Thomas.
You could phrase it the other way, that a human being by their own actions never descends to the level of the beasts.
Sure. No, he's saying the moral status. Boethius makes a similar quote when he says that actually we we descend not to the level of the beasts when we act bestial. We descend lower because we're acting out of accord with our nature, where the beasts are meant to be bestial. So that doesn't mean that Boethius thinks human beings don't have dignity. He's just saying they're not acting in accord with their dignity. That's what Thomas is saying.
And he says they could be treated as such.
But no, you're not treating somebody without dignity when you kill them, when it's an act of justice. That would be a contradiction in terms. What Francis and JP2 are saying here is that for these three parties in society, all of whom deserve the protection of the state, the guilty party themselves, other prisoners, which still have dignity in prison, they merit the protection of the state, and then individual parties. Let's take the popes at their word now that we've disposed of that. If a means of punishment, what's more in accord with dignity? If a means of punishment is 7 to 8 times more likely to lead to some imperfect act of contrition than another one, what would we say about it? As a
we would say it leads to that, but we couldn't say that it's right. Because I'll give you an example. Suppose
we already know it's right.
Well, then we don't even need this argument, because you could say, all right, some people are on death row for 15, 20 years. They die on death row. They're overturned. They're released. I could get people to confess really quickly by doing false executions or leaving the date of their execution unknown to them. And so since they don't know that, you might die tomorrow. You might be being led to a false execution. You might convert, and then something will kit from that. But that's obviously
what the numbers suggest.
That's a cruel.
So you're saying the numbers suggest nothing. That when somebody has, this is one of the things you pray for, is a happy death. Knowing ahead of time when you're going to die
I'm not
is like
disputing
a
that.
cheat. Even the most wicked in society, murderers, for whatever reason, I think I could name it, they're 7 to 8 times more likely to say some kind of sorry, which is a much better hope which is really what we're willing towards these people. We're called to love them as well. They're 7 to 8 times more likely on death row than if they don't know the day of their death.
But that doesn't
justify
justify
they led a bad life.
That good effect. One cannot do evil so that good may come. Because you could try.
It's already just. We agreed on that.
Right, because you could also use torture. You could use other things and say, people are likely to convert when they're threatened with that.
Of course. But this cuts against JP2 and Francis, not against me. I'm not the one that says that the necessary justification for the death penalty is number 2. I say it's number 1. They're the ones that imply that the only unique justification is number 2, which would be Catholic consequentialism.
And my point
Either
is that
way,
the
the argument wins.
Right,
for the death
but my point is that natural law and the church teaching does not follow point number 1, in that in order for a punishment to be just, some crimes deserve death. That doesn't follow.
That's not a principle. A principle is an invisible principle whereby something is rendered intelligible to the human mind, right? So the principle of justice it wouldn't be predicable across all the categories, to use Aristotelian language, to call it a principle of justice or the principle of temperance or any of the virtues. If we pre-applied them, that's not what I'm doing. I'm saying that the clear definition of justice, which justifies, cross-justifies the death penalty, is the idea of proportionality. Or retributivism, same thing. Right. Or what Pius XII very clearly distinguishes expiation from JP2 and Francis's eventual bad reasoning on the death penalty. It's just bad reasoning. They say they really insinuate strongly that there's only one reason you ever put someone to death, is the state, and there's only one just way to do it. They're wrong. They say the only reason you do it is to protect people. That's dead wrong.
But they don't.
That would be consequentialism. I thought we agreed.
No, we do agree that a guilty person deserves punishment, and that is
proportional.
And St. Thomas Aquinas even says in this life there are 2 kinds of retribution: medicinal and, I guess, vengeful is the other word that's used. He says primarily in this life, retribution is medicinal in purpose. That's its primary point, which is why he says not every mortal sin a person commits is worthy of death by the state, because it's primarily medicinal. The ones that are worthy of death, from Thomas's perspective, are those that are not conducive to the common good of society. Mm-hmm. So I still see this as a legitimate development. All right, all right. Here's what I want to do now. We've been going about an hour or so. Bit of a gridlock here. I guess the point now is where to go from here. I guess I'll offer. Yeah, I guess what's hard for me sometimes is that I will see people who, I'll just be honest with you. I'll see some Catholics on the one hand who will tell their Protestant friends, like, I can't believe you believe in sola scriptura. I can't believe you do all that. You don't have authority. Look at the chaos you get. And yet at the same time, they only believe those magisterial teachings they can vouch for based on their own personal understanding of documents. And that if the church teaches something contrary to what they believe, they don't want to submit to that. That seems like a double standard to me. So it seems to me like what's being taught here is doctrine, not infallible. It's something that could change in the future. We don't know. But it's taught as something to be received as doctrine. So if we're Catholic, shouldn't we receive what the church teaches?
This is not taught as doctrine. It's inadmissible, and it's absolutely not. This is, for one thing, it's the Catechism, which gets corrected all the time. Number two, Francis cites no one but himself here, suggesting that even if it weren't the Catechism, it wouldn't be magisterial. The idea of the magisterium is you're in conformity with all the prior magisteria. He cites himself, for heaven's sake.
But he's the Pope. He's the vicar of Christ.
But you can't cite yourself, and the Pope is not sui generis as to doctrine, right? 266 has to acknowledge 265.
Wait, what are you talking? Oh, the popes,
yeah,
the numbers.
The popes, yeah. So
you mean 267? No, is he 266?
I forget what he is. 266 or 267.
Let's just say Francis and Benedict.
Yeah, so they have to cite the magisterium before them. I read to you a bunch of doctors and
but he does. The paragraph cites John Paul II before that as justification.
But so this is why I said, in 2,000 years of an embrace of the death penalty as a principle of justice, not as a consequential reasoning solely, principle of justice with some happy consequential effects. The Catholic Church has embraced the death penalty up until basically one guy, JP2. He doesn't like it. It's stuck in his craw. Let's assume that somehow his reasoning about those three parties in society were correct. They're wrong, right? Because technology doesn't take away parole, doesn't take away recidivism. It doesn't take away the hundreds of prisoners that are killed in prison every year. If you can't kill those murderers, what do you do?
But you can't do unjust things. Do you want to take away all of their appeals?
But we already
process?
agreed it's already just. You and I agreed. The death penalty is per se just. We're just talking about where and when to apply it.
No, I haven't agreed to that. I said that it was seen as something that is just when it was used as a means to protect the common good of society. That doesn't mean that it's just in and of itself.
The common good is subsumed by
the same as apparatuses of slavery were just when that was the only means to provide people credit and have a backbone of the economy. But it's something that now we understand it's offense to the dignity of the human person.
That's wild, man.
We should no longer have.
You're saying that principles of justice can change. That's why I'd rather debate this as a natural law principle. The geometric proportion does not change. You know how I can prove that to you? 1:2 as 2:4, right? The basic idea of analogy.
We don't execute thieves anymore. Or heretics.
No, but I would support executing heretics if we lived in a church state. I mean, I wouldn't say it. What I sure as heck wouldn't do is say it violates the principle of justice when it is the living, breathing, instantiated principle of geometric justice. But so I mean, furthermore, you're ignoring the really strong proof I made at the very beginning when I said, look. It would be you can't do wrong to effectuate a right action or a right end, and so even the popes that like JP2 that thought you could kill in order to protect. You could kill death penalty deservers, i.e., murderers, in order to protect future deaths.
No, that's not true.
But you don't get to kill 100% of murderers to get to 7% unless it's an act of justice.
God allowed people to do evil in Scripture to prevent greater evils.
I'm not talking about direct, supernatural, divine revelation.
No,
I'm not
talking
even
about just that, but just the law that allowed for divorce in the Old Testament to prevent.
Getting more out on the limb.
No, not at all. You're saying that because
not like Jericho.
Because it was seen as being just in order to secure the common good, therefore it's intrinsically just in and of itself. That's not the case. It could just be something that was seen as appropriate and acceptable because it was put to a guilty party that deserved some kind of punishment, and the punishment was warranted because it protected society and it protected the common good. So
but that's a new position.
There's no contradiction.
Well, there's a change, which is a contradiction. This is a new position
Doctrine.
you didn't even have on your prior podcast. The first 20 minutes when we brought up, and you were like, yeah, there are 3 justifications for the death penalty. And I said, well, I think there are like 5, but who cares? In any justification for a moral act, there's always a necessary one, and then the rest of them are contingent.
And what the church has progressed to see is that retribution does not require the death penalty, and that the protection of the common good does not require it.
We're not talking about requirements. JP2 and Francis are trying to require that the principle of expiation retributivism now means its own opposite. And that cannot be done.
Here's the point that they make. They make is that because it is no longer required by these justifications, it becomes wrong because of the violence against an innocent person. It's not an innocent person. Violence against a human being. Just the same way that Thomas's argument in the Summa Theologia is that, in his argument, I'm not convinced by in any way, shape, or form, that he says, well, you can cut off a gangrenous limb to save the body. Then why not do the same thing with a human being? That's an argument for separation. Yeah, you can separate my arm from my body.
That's an analogy. That's not his argument.
But it's not. I know. But the analogy breaks down because human beings are not like limbs. They're goods in and of themselves that are deserving of this kind of basic respect.
But the church has never taught that the state, who holds the power, disposes the power of life and death. How many different articles do we need?
Let me finish about the analogy.
Listen to this. I haven't read this yet. This is Pope Innocent I. It must be remembered that power was granted by God to the magistrates, and to avenge crime by the sword was permitted. He who carries out this vengeance is God's minister. And then he cites Romans 13. Why should we condemn a practice that all hold to be permitted by God? All. So not specific species of it, generally. We uphold, therefore, what has been observed until now, in order not to alter the discipline, and so that we may not appear to act contrary to the Pope's authority. This is Pope Innocent I.
But Innocent I, he also says, in regards to this teaching that has been handed down, he says that about these things, we read nothing definitive from the forefathers about when it's to be applied or its nature.
All that's definitive is it can never be called an act of injustice per se. That's the only thing I'm claiming is definitive. And I'm 100% certain that it's not 99%. It's definitive as a principle of natural law. That an act of justice can never be unjust. It's that simple. That doesn't mean every state has to use it. That's not what anyone's arguing.
It can be if situations change, and that's the point I'm making with what since John Paul II is teaching on the death penalty. That if you remove these justifications because we have bloodless means, we understand retribution retribution can have a maximum bloodless penalty. Then all you have left with is a killing of a human being without justification, which would be wrong. Much to follow Aquinas's analogy, if you had a gangrenous limb and you had a means to save the limb without amputating it, and you chose to amputate it anyways, that would be wrong because it would be an act of mutilation. Now, mutilation might have been okay in the 12th century when that was the only means you had to save the body. But if you have other means today, it would become mutilation. You see how things can change.
That's only the one justification. And furthermore, you haven't answered any. That's the single justification, the less important one, protection of people. We agreed that there are multiple.
I have addressed it.
We agreed there are multiple justifications. Yeah. The justice principle is the primary one, right? The church teaches that timelessly. And essentially, if you're saying that the main one is the consequentialist one, then you are imputing to JP2 consequentialism.
No, I'm not, because it's not the only one.
You're saying
it's not the only one.
Great. So it's not the only one. But it's the only one he seeks to abrogate. No, it's not the primary one. It's a consequentialist one. There are good consequentialist reasons for any act, right? The principal reason that I do an act of chastity is invisible. It's not so that I don't get an STD. It's not so that
it's to conform to the moral law.
It's to conform to the moral law.
Right.
So and this is what Phaser's really strong on. That's the principle of an action.
But that's
the first idea of an action is conforming to the moral law.
But where he's weak on is
JP2 is only saying, he's only addressing, abrogating, because he thinks that technology means that parole doesn't exist anymore. I haven't quite worked that out.
No,
he's only saying, he's making a consequentialist argument. Maybe these consequences have changed, and I guess he's a consequentialist.
No,
that's his only justification.
Absolutely not. What he is saying is that just as in the past we have developed bloodless means to protect society from heretics, thieves, rapists even. We should continue on that path if we've developed the same thing for even murderers, which is a novel thing in the 20th century, to restrict the death penalty just to this class, not even all people who kill, just the most grievous kinds of people or the most dangerous kinds of people. If we have bloodless means for them, it should apply to them as well, because they're equal in their basic rights and the respect due to them of any other human being.
But that would mean that JP2 is saying prior to, 1997, that he was saying you can kill a whole class of people, and not special mandate from God. The magistrate can kill a whole special class of people, and that's an act of injustice, I guess, according to you, not me and JP2. It's an act of injustice. They can do it because they like the consequence, that it protects other people. I say you can do it because it's not an act of injustice. You can look at it it's an act of justice.
No, you can look at it in two ways.
The only way to look at it.
Well, for those who oppose the death penalty, there's two ways you can look at it. Something it was previously just because of the circumstances justifying the use of this penalty to protect society, just like the amputating the limb example. Or for those who hold it's intrinsically evil, they'll say that it was unjust, but that the church had erred in this application of the moral principle, thou shalt not kill.
But circumstances don't, that's the whole point, Trent. Circumstances do not justify a moral act. Only the principle of the moral act does.
Would it be wrong for us?
What is the principle of justice?
But
it is the interior rightness communicated by either nature or supernature.
You're contradicting yourself.
From the mind of God. I'm definitely not contradicting
You are, because
myself.
circumstances do change it, because the question is, would it be just or should we execute heretics? You, in your answer previously, said that circumstances would answer that question.
Obviously, we're talking about with things that aren't intrinsic evils. It sounds here. I didn't come in here thinking you thought the death penalty was an intrinsic evil.
I'm not settled.
You're talking
on the
about
issue.
it. You sound like you're leaning towards it when you debate with me. I'm not saying that as some diss. You sound like you think it's an intrinsic evil. Intrinsic evils can never become acceptable with changing circumstances. You accept that, right? That basic teaching of Catholic moral theology.
That a intrinsic evil can never be... No, of course not, but no one's arguing that with the death penalty.
You just did. You said the death penalty might be an intrinsic evil, and it was justified before. If it's an intrinsic evil...
No, I'm saying if it's not that...
What?
No, what I am saying is that there are two views. You could say that it was evil because of previous circumstances, or it is just intrinsically evil itself.
You said you're somewhat sympathetic to that point of view. I'm not, that's whack.
I know, I'm not... Hey, I'm just trying to be honest here. I'm sifting through the data and evidence.
But I just posed the question that said, okay, but an intrinsic evil, you're saying intrinsic evil means forever.
My point is this, is that it is evil. It is an offense to the dignity of the person. It may not be intrinsically evil in the same way that slavery is an offense to the dignity of the person, but it was something that could be justified given previous socio-economic situations where it was either slavery or starvation.
Slavery is unjust, though. Slavery is the opposite of the principle of geometric proportion.
But you don't. Well,
right? A human being cannot be owned by another human being. Slavery is the opposite of the death penalty. The death penalty is the instantiation, the very life of justice.
But the church
called so by. Look, the Council of Trent. It has nothing to do with circumstances in 1500
wait a minute. But the Bible.
This prohibition does not apply to the magistrate to whom is entrusted the power of life and death.
But Tim, the Bible and throughout much of church history, slavery was upheld as something that could be moral.
But slavery was never called the principle of justice itself. It was never equated.
St. Paul told slaves, obey your masters. Previous church councils said it was wrong for slaves to run away and escape their masters.
Do you think slavery is an intrinsic evil?
I think that some forms of slavery are intrinsic evils.
You keep making this argument by analogy, and it's making it more difficult because I haven't studied up on slavery, so I'm not prepared to. Yeah, I mean you're all boned up on that, but the point is, why make an argument by analogy? All we know, a couple of guys that know the faith, an intrinsic evil can never be justified by changing circumstances. That's as sure as, or else I'll just go be.
It can be tolerated.
No. It can never be justified by meaning made right. God is subject to the principle of non-contradiction. An intrinsic evil is something that is by its essence always evil, always will be evil. It can never be called right. And so the death penalty being called right, the principle of geometric justice, way unlike slavery. I mean, there was maybe tolerations of conditional tolerations of slavery. I don't even know which passages you're specifically referring to. It's not my area I'm boned up on. But slavery is to the natural law. Let's reason from that. It is the violation of geometric proportion.
Aquinas and Aristotle said that there are some people who are not naturally owed to be slaves, but some people who could be by circumstance.
Natural law, meaning we can talk, neither of us believe in slavery. I'm presuming I'm on solid
I hope
footing
everyone
there.
who listens knows we're not trying to defend slavery. But my point is that...
but slavery is the owning of another human being, right? The idea that natural rights
depends what you mean by that. Chattel would mean you own them like you own a chair or an oxen.
Fine.
Indentured servitude, slavery would be you own their labor and you can restrict their movement.
Right. So
and there was a time throughout church
natural
history,
rights.
This happened, and even by natural law, there were theologians who said, this second kind, you don't treat them like an animal.
Those aren't natural. Those might be natural law theologians that are prone, that have some error.
Aquinas and Aristotle allow for it.
Aquinas and Aristotle have some occasional little errs, right?
He could be right. I agree. He's wrong on the death penalty.
No. Good one. But the point is, he's at the very least, he's consonant with almost 20 centuries of teaching. And with the natural law. And when I say the natural law, I'm not just adverting to the history of thought. Yeah. I'm saying a principle we can reason about right now. Slavery is against nature, right? It's an intrinsic thing that is in a logical antinomy. The death penalty, the principle of proportion itself, is being given life, given soul.
No, that's not correct, because I believe, for example, if you define slavery as you force prison inmates to make license plates, I do not think that is evil. But it technically falls under the definition of slavery. They can't leave and they have to work. They don't get paid. This isn't. I know you say, why are you bringing up slavery? Well, I'm trying to make an analogy here that I think
it's an extended analogy, though. It's not helpful.
But it's important that
it's befuddling.
Circumstances can change. So in that circumstance, we understand slavery to be acceptable in that very limited penal circumstance that's well defined. But in the large majority of cases throughout history where it was used, where it was seen as good at one point, we now see that it's evil. So let's take the death penalty that's intrinsic evil, we'll move it off the table, because I don't think the Catechism teaches that. That's why it goes to pains to use the word inadmissible. It's like something that just should not...
Not a theological term. Yeah.
It should not be done. Well, like you do law, like if evidence is inadmissible, the evidence could be good, but a circumstance prevents it from being introduced in court.
I've heard inadmissibles never appeared in any other document.
Well, it's not... It's not one word. I forget
it's
the three Latin words.
It's trying to bend two parallel lines and make them meet in eternity. So they have to use a weird term, like Francis is always doing. And so I think it's a weird term that is non-theological in nature, sort of like the way he uses human dignity. This is not in accordance with Catholic theology. Sort of like the way he uses the common good. This is a popular term. He's only referring to the most reductive sense of bodily integrity, and
So he's saying it should not. It just should not be done anymore, given the changing circumstances, which we could apply from my last example, and we'll have to wrap up here soon.
That we have too much water. I got to go to the bathroom.
Right. So. These mugs are deceptively large.
They are.
We can, when we change our understanding of how the death penalty is applied throughout history, as well as other things that were considered necessary for the social order but turned out to be offenses to the dignity of a human person, such as executing heretics, being an infringement on genuine religious liberty and freedom, or slavery, other things like that, there's still a continuity in the development of the doctrine here. So let's bring this together. I'm just going to quote a passage from the Catechism that I think many people would agree with. It talks about the section of defense under bodily integrity. And it talks about how it just says under bodily integrity, kidnapping, it's probably referring to torture, but it doesn't actually explicitly say that. It says in times past, cruel practices were commonly used by legitimate governments to maintain law and order, often without protest from the passage of the church, who themselves adopted in their own tribunals the prescriptions of Roman law concerning torture. It's about torture. Regrettable as these facts are, the church always taught the duty of clemency and mercy. She forbade clerics to shed blood. Like clerics couldn't be involved in torture or the death penalty. In recent times, it has become evident that these cruel practices were neither necessary for public order nor in conformity with the legitimate rights of the human person. On the contrary, these practices led to ones even more degrading. It is necessary to work for their abolition. We must pray for victims and their tormentors. Now, it's not complete analogy, but my point is that I believe you can read this, what the Catechism has said in the new paragraph 2267, as being a continual development in the understanding that the state has the duty to protect society and to carry out justice, but the more that it can move towards a bloodless means for doing that is in keeping with the dignity of the person, and in doing so, they ought to do that if they can achieve a just carrying out of sentences that protect people. They should do so in respect to the human person whose life is a basic good. So,
okay,
that's
since
my
this is
closing.
anti-torture. I'm being tortured. Can I go to the bathroom and then make a statement? I am literally about to die. Are you? So I need to do it.
How about we'll be done? We'll be done.
All right, yeah, because I am sitting here squirming. Man, I drank a lot of water, and coffee, and orange juice. Yeah. So, well, the
last statement, then we'll go.
Last statement. So there are multiple justifications for any moral act. The principle of the moral act is the unchanging necessary condition by which that moral act can be done in accordance with the natural law and the moral law, the supernatural moral law. By definition, I've showed here, I opened up, it was a little abstruse, but if you go back and listen to it, there's a retortive proof that the sole reason, the ontologically main reason that the death penalty was embraced by the church for 20 centuries cannot have been the protection of society, which is essentially the same thing I could do if someone walked in here. In order for society to put to death, JP2 even would admit, any single murderer, right? Because they don't know that murderer will become a recidivist. There has to be something ontologically prior that's unchanging, that is a principle of justice itself, a juridical principle, by which that happy circumstance might be obtained. That happy circumstance being, I kill X, and then X can't potentially go out and kill other people. Like, think of the movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise. It gets into all kinds of weird moral philosophy where they supposedly find out using technology, JP2 and Francis will approve. Technology says this guy's going to become a murderer. And the moral conundrum is, so can we go kill him in order to obtain the same happy circumstance that I guess Francis and JP2 think is the sole justification of the death penalty, or they seem to anyway? Well, that would be wrong. That you can never do an intrinsic evil, killing an innocent party, which is an intrinsic evil, in order to get a good effect. Similarly, the death penalty must be just by definition, because in order to even achieve that happy effect, that party must be a guilty party, rendering it a prior principle of justice, which enables us to say, okay, we'll kill 100% of these murderers even though only about 7 or 8% of them will ever kill again if they hit the streets.
But we don't know. We don't know which ones.
We don't know which ones. That gives life to the argument. Because we don't know which ones, Trent, then it's like, yeah, you can kill 100% of murderers because you're not violating the interior principle. I say, yeah, I'm still a hermeneutic of continuity guy. JP2 and Francis, in their various writings, Catechism and otherwise, never abrogate the main principle, so it carries on undeterred. Now, their one main idea seems to be that technology has meant that everyone is perfectly protected from recidivism rates of murderers. This is factually untrue, but because parties are paroled and they go murder again every day. Prisoners are murdered in prison. That's how Ted Bundy escaped from prison twice. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed in prison. It happens every day. So it's not right, even according to justification number 2, but who cares? Because we have justification number 1, the principle of justice itself, which enables all the other justifications a con law professor or a Catholic theologian could ever adduce for the death penalty, meaning that's fine. They think they abrogated reason number 2. Number 1 carries on, even according to the good popes themselves. They never abrogated them. We still have the right to do the death penalty.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. I won't subject you to any more torture, any more as you can go. But once again, good dialogue, sir.
Good dialogue.
We're going to check out his work. Thank you for listening. Hope you all have a very blessed day.
If you liked today's episode, become a premium subscriber at our Patreon page and get access to member-only content. For more information, visit TrentHornPodcast.com.